member for the League of Women Voters. Before we start, I wanted to remind everyone at this time to silence their phones. Recording is permissible. I think it is being recorded. It's not recorded tonight, but I think we're fine if anybody wants to record or take photos. On behalf of the League of Women Voters in Murfreesboro and Rutherford County, welcome to the debate, The Right to Safety Gun Ownership in America. I'm League member Meredith Thomas, as I said. The local league has been serving citizens of our area since 1957. We're nonpartisan, meaning we never support a candidate or a party, but we do study and adopt positions on a wide variety of issues. Tonight we're glad to have debate teams from MTSU and Belmont examining this issue. From MTSU, we have Coach Pat Ritchie, and I will let him introduce his team at this time.
Hello, I'm just going to stand over here because there's plenty of but first of all, thank you all for coming out. Quick announcement, if you're a student at MTSU and you are here for extra credit, make sure you sign out before you leave over there so you can get your professor. Also, if your professor is cool like me and gives you extra credit for buttons, or if you just want a button, we have debate buttons and our Common Studies Department buttons. As for MTSU Debate, we are an old team on campus, or one of the oldest organizations, 100 plus years, and we travel, but we also believe firmly in civic engagement as a team, i.e. we don't just go to tournaments and win trophies, but we believe giving back to the community and modeling what debate ought to be, which in this time is probably a pretty important thing. And so MTSU Debate, along with our friends from Belmont, like to give what we call model debates, where we debate a topic, but we only debate the issue at hand. No ad hominems, we don't attack each other for being ugly or mean or whatever. We do that behind the scenes. But on the podium, we give you a real debate, and we pride ourselves. We will not take a side to like the league. We give both sides of a topic. And so we try to give a balanced kind of view of either side so that you can see what the facts are and where the arguments lie. And so tonight we have a good group of debaters. Amongst the whole group here, you have state and national champions and solid students who have been doing this for a long time. And so on this side from MTSU is Jordan Nickel. She's a junior. You want to stand or wave? Or? Okay. Next to her is Josh Hendricks. He's a junior. We got him from Walter State. Next to Josh is Sky Irish. She is a senior. And then on the other side, helping because of numbers, is also an MTSU debater, Alex Fingerroot, who's also a senior. And now I'll turn it over to my friend from Belmont.
It's always good. I'm about to announce our debaters, but it's especially not being the hometown team. I'm glad at least we have a hometown debater that we can bring. So even if you can't go ahead and cheer for the Belmont side, at least you can cheer for the Murfreesboro person from Belmont for our side. I'd like to go ahead and represent and announce to you the debaters that we have representing Belmont's debate team today. First is Tyler Redmond. He is our Murfreesboro native here, as well as Emily Vo. They're both freshmen and debaters. They've had a fantastic year, and I think that you're going, even though they're a freshman, you won't be able to tell it in the debate. They are going to present us a fantastic case. I hope you all enjoy both sides today.
Let's all give them a hand for both teams are prepared to argue either for or against the questions presented and will adhere to established rules and arguments and rebuttals in the allotted time, just 7 minutes. Our format tonight does not allow questions from the audience, and it's important to note that team members may not be arguing their personal beliefs on any of the questions considered. The league will share our national position on the issue after the debate. So we'll go ahead and get started. I will now entertain a speech from the opposition, not to exceed 7 minutes.
So before I get started with my speech, I'd just like to say thank you for coming out tonight to listen to us. I'd also like to thank the League of Women Voters for letting us have this forum today. I think it's incredibly important. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and start my 7 minutes. So according to a recent study done by the American Journal of Epidemiology and the CDC, we see that 31,076 Americans die every year due to gun-related violence. That's 85 Americans a day. And to give you just a little bit more perspective, from the time I stand up to the time I sit down, that's approximately 3 citizens who will die due to gun-related violence. So when we break that down further into some statistics, we see that 70% of all murders involve a firearm, 35% of these gun deaths are due to homicide, and 62% of these deaths are due to suicide. So we see that there needs to be a change somewhere in our system. We see that there's a problem. So what do we need to do? And we see that regulations work, and that is why that we are proud to stand in affirmation of the topic that gun regulations will lead to a safer United States. So throughout today's debate, I'm going to go over a couple of pretty common policy points that are brought up when we talk about regulation. But we can see that these regulations are successful due to a National Institute of Justice study that examined a cross-country look, and we can see that 3 states with the weakest gun laws, Alaska, Louisiana, and Mississippi, all score an F rating for gun safety, according to the Giffords Law Center. And they have approximately a 19.8 deaths out of every 100,000 citizens. So we see that when we look at this per capita for these individual states that have low gun laws, and then we look at states such as Hawaii, Massachusetts, or California that have incredibly strict gun laws that receive a rating of A by the Giffords Law Center, which only has a 2.7 gun death per 1,000 citizens, we can see that these regulations are effective. So the first regulation that we're going to look at today are permits and background checks. So we see currently that 15 states require you to have a license or a permit in order to own or sell a gun. And we see that background checks currently utilize the FBI's National Instant Criminal Background Check System. And what it essentially does is it examines the purchaser and sees that they are a felon, a fugitive, have been convicted of domestic abuse, or are considered to be mentally ill. Now, what is defined as mentally ill varies from state to state and can raise a little bit of debate, but we see that these background checks, these categories, have actually stopped over 3 million gun sales from taking place, according to NPR. So essentially what we see is there are 3 million potential gun-related incidents that have been stopped due to these background checks. We can also look according to a study that was conducted in Connecticut and found that when they implemented mandatory background checks, there was a 40% decrease in the rate of homicides and a 15% decrease in the rate of gun-related suicides. On the opposite scale of this, we can look to Missouri, who in 2007 repealed their permit to purchase laws, meaning you did not have to have a license or background check before you purchased a firearm. And when that occurred, we saw a 23% increase in homicides and a 16% increase in gun-related suicides. So what this tells us is that having these permits and having these background checks in place do offer a buffer, and it helps stop these potential deaths that can occur. The second policy point that we see today is mandatory waiting periods. Mandatory waiting periods require that an individual wait a set period of time before they're allowed access to the firearm that they purchase. This is usually between 2 to 7 days, but some states, such as Hawaii, have it as high as 14 to 20 days. So we do see a little bit of differential time between various states. But a study conducted by the University of California found a direct correlation between having these waiting periods and having a decrease in gun violence. So we see that states with this mandatory waiting period have 17% fewer homicides and 10% fewer gun-related suicides. And so we can see that these regulations here, they're working. And this is largely due to what is considered to be the cooling period. So according to the American Medical Association, this is a time when an individual who may be suffering from suicidal thoughts or may be going through anger issues or something and would want to do harm to themselves or others do not have immediate access to a firearm. So during that time, they're able to either get help from outside resources or they're able to cool down and decide to make a better decision. But either way, we see that this regulation is effective in stopping potential gun deaths. The third one that we're going to talk to you today about is mandatory safe laws. So this is essentially where an individual purchases a firearm and they are required to have it locked up inside their home when it is not in use. And we see, according to the Giffords Law Center, that from 2005 to 2014, there are 20,000 minors who are either killed or seriously injured due to gun violence in the home. And we see that 55% of gun owners reported keeping their guns in an unlocked place. This could change if we had gun regulations. According to the U.S. General Accounting Office, 31% of all accidental deaths could be avoided by mandatory gun safes. So let's look at some states that actually have these. We can look at Massachusetts, which is the only state that requires it to be stored at all times when not in use, regardless of who is present. And we see that their suicide and homicide rate is around 9%. And you can compare that to the national average of 39%. So they have an incredibly drastic decrease in the amount of deaths that they see. In California, Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey, you're required to have your gun placed in a safe if there are children present. And we see that in these states, they experience 40% fewer suicides due to guns per capita and 68% fewer gun deaths per capita. So we see the 3 regulations we've mentioned today are effective in decreasing the rate of not only gun violence, but gun-related suicides as well. So it's beneficial for the individuals in the home, but for our society as a whole. And these are not, political-sided regulations today. We see that they have bipartisan support. We can see, according to a study done by the Pew Research Center in March of 2018, that 74% of NRA members support universal background checks. We can see that 83% of all total gun orders support these background checks. So this is supported by people on both sides of the political spectrum because they see that it's effective. Furthermore, we see that 68% of gun owners support mandatory waiting periods and 67% support mandatory safe laws. So at the end of the day, when we look back over the affirmatives case today, through these various policy points, we can see that it is effective and practical in lowering the use or the rate of gun violence. For these reasons, I'm proud to stand in affirmation of the topic that regulations will lead to a safer United States. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech, Scott. I'll now entertain a speech from opposition, not to exceed 7 minutes.
So before I begin, I'd like to echo the blanket of thank yous that Sky just issued. It's truly an honor to be here, but also be representing MTSU, or I guess in this case, Belmont. So we'll go ahead and get started now. So before we really begin, I'd like to go ahead and clarify our position. So we are saying that gun control would not necessarily lead to a safer America, but what we are not saying is that some sort of change isn't necessary. I say, hopefully that I speak for our side when I say that the 31,076 gun deaths that Sky just brought up that happen every year, that's not good. But ultimately where we disagree though is the solutions for the problem. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to address some of the points that Sky just brought up, and then I'm going to jump into our own case and really hopefully clarify why gun control isn't necessarily the answer. So first of all, Sky brings up this idea that the 3 states that have the weakest gun laws also have some of the lowest ratings in terms of gun safety, and mentions Alaska, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Then for comparison, Sky brings up Hawaii, Massachusetts, and California, and basically mentions that while they have stronger regulations, they also have better safety records. Well, I'd like to propose that this is not necessarily causation. So yes, I will say, statistically speaking, this is probably true. At the end of the day, there are certainly other factors that play into the amount of gun deaths that happen in each of these states. So if we look at Alaska, Mississippi, and Louisiana, typically speaking, socioeconomically speaking, they are much more poor. Their education systems are not quite as good as the education systems in places like Massachusetts, Hawaii, and California. And so socioeconomic factors are actually to blame in those particular instances. Ultimately, what we see is that, generally speaking, there's a positive correlation between poverty and crime. And unfortunately, what we see is in these states that have these weaker gun regulations, we also see pretty high rates of poverty. Then Sky brings up this idea of background checks. And we're going to talk about this idea of mental illness in just a moment. But it's problematic to say that background checks that actually bring up mental illness would help solve the problem, because ultimately that's not solving the root of the problem, which is the mental illness itself. And we'll jump into that in just a moment. Sky also brings up basically how background checks have helped decrease homicides in certain areas. Well, for every area that has decreased homicides due to background checks, we can point to an area like Chicago. Illinois has pretty stringent gun requirements, and yet Chicago itself as a city has really, really high rates of gun violence. Obviously problematic. So again, here we see a case where it's not necessarily causation, but correlation. Then Sky brings up the idea of waiting periods, and basically says that waiting periods, states with waiting periods have fewer homicides and suicides. But again, the states that are more likely to issue these types of laws also have different socioeconomic factors in play that create these types of effects. Then Sky brings up this idea of mandatory safe laws. And I'd like to point out that Sky mentioned that California and Connecticut, among some other states, have these safe laws. And the unfortunate reality is that we've seen shootings in these states that are high-profile shootings. Connecticut, for instance, a few years ago had the Newtown shooting in a situation where Ultimately, what we saw was that the shooter actually took guns from his parents' house. California, we saw a shooting actually just last week at the YouTube headquarters. And so what we see is that while mandatory safe laws might have some benefit, it's not, again, solving the root of the problem. So let's go ahead and jump into our own case. And first I'd like to touch on this idea of mental health. So ultimately, what we see is that in the news, one of the biggest reasons that we're talking about gun control is that we have had these mass shootings recently, these very, very unfortunate mass shootings. And that is a problem. I'm not going to say that that isn't. Ultimately, what we see is that 1% of all gun deaths come from mass shooters with severe mental illnesses. So what that means is, number one, most gun deaths are not coming from these mass shooters, they're coming from more localized situations, which we'll get to in just a moment. But ultimately what we see is that when we have these mass shooting instances, the majority of the time, they're carried out by people who have been diagnosed with some sort of severe mental illness, 59% of the time, according to the Los Angeles Times. A peer-reviewed study from the Journal of Law and Human Behavior actually suggests that there is this link between mental illness and gun violence. But ultimately what we see, and actually something that Scott herself just mentioned, is that the vast majority of gun deaths in the United States come not from these types of shootings, but actually from suicides. It's in the 62-64% range. So the vast majority of the gun deaths that we see. And so ultimately, in order to actually prevent this type of violence, this type of self-harm from coming into play, what we need to do is actually solve the root of the issue, which in this case is mental illness. Right now what we see are severe cuts to funding for mental health research. We see prisons that are used essentially as holding pens for the mentally ill in a number of different states. And so ultimately what we see is that these types of issues are not being addressed while we're sitting here talking about gun control. We're not doing anything about preventing the 62% of gun deaths that are suicides, or preventing the 1% of gun deaths that come from these mass shooters with severe mental illnesses. Which moves me into my second point, which is gun ownership. Ownership is not actually the problem. So a lot of the types of laws that Sky just brought up and is advocating for wouldn't actually solve the other problem, which is the fact that in 79% of cases where there is a gun crime, the perpetrator was carrying a firearm owned by somebody else. Background checks aren't going to help because a lot of these guns are either stolen or they're obtained illegally. Waiting periods are not going to help for the same reason. And even these mandatory safe laws wouldn't necessarily work either, because if there is a gun in the household, that's still going to be accessible by members of the family, which is what we saw again in Connecticut. 3% of cases are unknown, in addition to that 79%, so that means only in 18% of cases does the perpetrator actually legally own the gun that they used for a particular gun crime. Furthermore, and this is actually most striking, 40% of stolen guns are not even reported as stolen until after the guns have already been used in some sort of crime. So people aren't being responsible with their guns. In fact, 62% of the time, owners don't even know where they've actually lost their guns. And so this is actually going to bring me into my third point, which is gun culture in the United States. First, we can look at the fact that Americans like their guns. There's actually roughly one gun for every single American, meaning there are roughly about 350 million guns in the United States, and any new laws would not be enforced on those old guns. So that means any new laws, even if we were to enforce this right now, we would still have 350 million guns out there because there's a law in Congress saying you can't enforce laws ex post facto. Furthermore, new laws always provoke gun sales. So again, what you're going to see with new laws is you're going to see a lot more people going out and buying more and more guns. And so ultimately, if we look at this, in this particular instance, the issue is not actually the ownership of guns. It's this gun culture that leads to people not taking care of their guns properly, not securing them properly, not using them properly, and when they are using them, not exercising the proper safety measures. And so ultimately, for all of these reasons, we deny the resolution. Thank you.
I will now entertain a speech to begin from the proposition not to exceed 7 minutes.
Is everyone ready? Okay, great. I would like to continue to extend the blanket of thank yous. We'll get that out of my throat. It might help me speak a little better. My name is Josh Hendricks, I'm from MTSU. It is a pleasure to be here and present for you all. With that being said, it's a very serious topic, so we'll go ahead and dive right on into it. So to get this started, I want to look at today's round. And we can see the two sides that were presented within today's round. Whether it be this idea that we need new gun regulations, or we need some cultural shift of gun ownership and how we view ourselves as firearm-owning citizens, when it comes down to the fact, as we can see, that the statistics are on the sides of saying, even if gun culture remains the same, even if people are still irresponsible with their guns, providing these laws still makes for a safer America. And then we can start to work on this idea of a gun culture. We'll get on to that. We're going to go ahead and start looking back onto what the opposition said about our case. The first thing we look at is this idea of when we look at the idea of the social economic factors that are leading to these conditions of where crime happens. And we do understand crime is positively correlated to poverty. People in harsh conditions excluded from the system often take what we consider to be drastic measures to survive, to make do. But then what we have to also understand is that doesn't then translate necessarily into these violent offenses of where people lose control. And the majority of these gun deaths are not inflicting violence to the mass population, but violence on the self, suicide. 62% of all gun deaths are suicide. And so when we talk about this idea of mental health and how it affects people in these social economic conditions, we are understanding the fact that this is drastically related to the harms people inflict upon themselves. And so when we see people in poverty-stricken relationships, we understand that it is exactly those people who likely have the least access to mental health care and don't need to be given the tools to inflict harm on themselves. You don't give someone who's saying, I'm going to shoot you, a gun. None the more should we give someone who's going to say, I'm going to shoot myself a gun. Because that's not productive. That's not producing a better society. Whether I'm rich or poor, if we come to this idea, we can see this evidence provided by the American Medical Association, that this cooling period, we talk about these waiting times, can really provide something, a little time. And sometimes that's everything they need, is to sit and realize the world's not exactly coming to an end. That the world, maybe I don't hate myself as much as I think I do. Maybe I don't hate my family as much as I think I do. Because we can see the fact of that when we're addressing people in poverty-stricken relations, we understand that their poverty may limit their access to health care. In fact, their conditions may lead them to have higher rates of depression and anxiety and other reasons people might seek to in their own lives. But at the core of what we understand is we're not going to, in other words, sell them the ropes to hang themselves with, because that's not productive. And so we have to look at what will provide a safer reality, a safer America, not provide tools and means to execute what might be harmful. The next thing we look at is when we look at background checks, and we can see there's areas of where crime spikes up in an individual city or an individual state and may decrease in other areas, or where we can see where background checks go up. It may not have been so successful in Chicago. Well, here's this really interesting thing. If there's strict gun laws in the city of Chicago, do you know where you get your guns? Anywhere outside of the city district of Chicago. And that's when we look at these ideas of gun control. It doesn't just need to be what the city of Murfreesboro can do, because if we pass an assault weapon ban here in Murfreesboro, the only thing a mass shooter is going to do is drive up to Davidson County, buy an assault rifle, and then come to our schools. And that's why we look at this idea that these regulations must not be a per city basis, but something we need to make a fundamental change at. And that's why we see, we're not saying gun control regulations will make Tennessee a safer place, but the United States will become a safer place if we act on a united front as this. And so we can also continue to tie this back to the idea of when we're solving the root of we're not giving people the tools, and we can solve this at a national level. The next thing I want to talk about is when we try to present on the facts what they presented and what debate we call their off case, the arguments they presented against that weren't refuting what we said. They look at this idea and say, well, this root of the problem still exists. It exists in this mental health category. It exists with spending being cut. We can tie this back to what I've said before. Just because we see funding getting cuts doesn't mean we should make the tools and means to cause harm and damage easier to get, and we should continue to provide those resources. Whether we can get up and say we need to increase or decrease mental health funding, reform of the prisons as outside of the control, whether we can say it's not good to sell people who are unstable and in need of help tools to cause harm. The next thing I want to look at is if we look at this concept of gun culture. It's this really interesting phenomenon. Why do we see guns as something that everyone needs? Why do we see guns as something so widespread in America that is fervently throughout our culture? Is that's because it's just as easy to buy a .22 LR as it is easy to buy taco seasoning. They both require about the same time at Walmart just down the street on North Boulevard. Because you can go in same day in Tennessee. I remember because we bought my brother one for his 18th birthday, a .22 LR, real easily. Because there aren't these regulations, because something in buying and owning a gun is seen as you don't need to keep it in a safe, you don't need to get a permit, you don't need to have a background check, you just go and pick it up when you're buying stuff for dinner. And that at the core in itself is the gun culture. We look at this transaction and process to start owning a gun. If it's just as easy, if it's harder to get your driver's license than it is to get a gun, something's wrong, and that is the gun culture. So if we start looking at how we allow people to obtain guns and obtain firearms, and we say you're going to have to wait a few days, you're going to need to go through these checks, you need to keep it in a lockbox at home, regardless if you're there or there's shown there, it needs to stay in a box if you aren't using it, because that is the culture surrounding guns. The fact that they can sit in a desk drawer, easily obtained. The fact that this isn't seen as something as that can end a human life, and it's seen as something that is collectible when it is a means of war and destruction. And these are not simple tools. They are not a hammer to buy at Lowe's. They are weapons designed with one thing and one thing in mind: to fight, to kill. And whether that's aggressive or you defend yourself, that is a little on the periphery. To understand the core meaning of the pull a trigger is to say whatever is in front of my trigger, I want it to no longer be. Whatever I'm pointing my gun at needs to stop. And so look at this idea of what is the gun culture? We need to change these regulations and change the process of what it means to own a gun if we ever want to see real change. And that is why I stand firmly in believing that if we change these laws and we have gun control and we have these regulations, we will see a safer America. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. I'll now entertain a speech from the opposition, not to exceed 7 minutes.
Well, I would also like to start by thanking everyone here. I'd like to thank the League of Women Voters for allowing us to have this platform for the debate. And I'd like to thank MTSU for being here, not only arguing against us, but also having one member help us out. To my partner from Belmont, and to both the coaches from the debate teams, and to everyone in the audience for being here. So the first thing I want to look at is I want to look at some of the points that were brought up by the affirmative case. And I want to look at the first thing talking about suicide. Suicides were a big thing brought up in the previous speech. And one thing that we look at is suicides in the United States are a non-unique issue when it comes to firearms. So what we're talking about with non-unique is we were saying whether there are or aren't firearms, suicides are still going to be an issue in the United States because of the underlying mental health issues and the availability for items that can lead to your death in a household. One of the biggest problems in the United States right now is that we're being overprescribed drugs. I'm sure anyone in their home right now has multiple pill bottles at home, any of which, if you took the whole bottle, could likely kill you. So what we see is that if you make a split-second decision, there are other routes you can take to commit suicide. And we see in many countries, including countries like South Korea, Japan, these places that have very strict gun laws, they still see a high rate of suicide with non-firearms and even with the firearms that are available in the nation. It is a non-unique issue to say that these guns are leading to suicides. They're just one of the means in which suicide can occur, that even without them, these suicides would still happen. One point that was also brought up was the fact that Massachusetts was one state that had lower suicide rates because they had much stricter gun laws. But one thing that needs to be pointed out is that Massachusetts is not a model state for the entire United States. Massachusetts is very urbanized. Their GDP per capita is much higher. People are making more money in the state of Massachusetts, so they're much more less likely to commit suicide because they're higher educated, they make more money, and they have better jobs. That's just the statistics when you look at states like Mississippi that are more downtrodden than a state like Massachusetts. We see that, of course, the suicide rate would be higher in those cases. That's a trend we see, and it's not related to the amount of guns, it's related to the status of those people. Another thing that we need to look at is when we talk about these gun-free zones and areas that are supposed to be protected from firearms, what we see is more often than not, mass shooters tend to aggregate around these gun-free zones as their targets because they know there will be few people firing back at them. These people are more likely to actually go out and carry through with it if they know they aren't necessarily at risk to themselves or them accomplishing what they believe their goal to be. So what we're saying is that when it comes to these gun-free zones, more often than not, it's just putting a target on your back saying, I will not defend myself because I don't have the capacity to defend myself. We also look at the gun culture in the United States today. So what we see is that every time regulation is talked about or brought up in the United States, every time Congress talks about it, every time a president talks about it, every time there's a mass shooting, we see gun sales on the rise, and it is because every time this topic is brought up, people feel more of a need to have weapons. There are a large amount of Americans who feel like this is their basic right because it is listed as their Second Amendment right to own these firearms. So when more regulation is talked about, if we for a moment believe that firearms are the problem, all talking about and trying to pass regulation does is make the problem worse because people will just obtain these weapons prior to any law being passed. I don't know that Congress could pass a law within a short enough time to stop people from buying a firearm. I don't think they could pass a law in a quick time for just about anything. So what we see is that people will be able to get this stuff done before anyone could do anything to stop them, and that's if we subscribe to the idea that firearms are actually the problem, which we do not. We also have to look at the black market. In many countries that have very strict gun laws, there are still many of millions of guns around because of black markets. We see in countries like Italy, where over 20% of the firearms there are traded through the black market, or in France, where over 40% of the firearms there are through the black market. This makes it more dangerous for American safety because we don't know who owns a gun, we don't know how many guns are in circulation, and if a crime is committed with this gun, how are we supposed to trace it if it's a black market gun that hasn't been registered and we don't know who owns it or where it's been or what it's been used in? So all this does is lead to these higher rates of black market weapons that we can't actually trace, and it makes it more difficult for the safety of Americans. So now, one example that I think is important that we look at is who do we blame for gun violence? More often than not, when we see gun violence, people go straight towards blaming the weapon itself, what conveyed the violence. They blame the firearm. But if we look in similar cases, something that even causes more deaths in the United States, automobile accidents. Whether it be through an accident, whether someone had been drunk driving or they were on drugs, we don't often blame the vehicle for the deaths of those people. We blame the person behind the wheel because they were the one responsible for taking an object like a car, which is an amoral vehicle. It's something that can be used for good or bad, and that person decided, whether willingly or not, to use it for a negative purpose. Firearms are the exact same way. Me having a gun doesn't make me a bad person. What makes me a bad person is actively choosing to use that gun in a negative way, something a majority of Americans, and certainly a majority of gun owners, choose not to do. In fact, when we look at the statistics from the Washington Post in 2018, they say that since 1966, there have been 150 mass shootings, more than 4 people killed in the shooting in the United States. In these mass shootings, 292 total guns were used. So when we see that there are over 300 million guns in circulation in the United States, this means that only and listen with me here, 0.00000, that's 5 zeros, 97% of firearms in the United States that have been sold have been used in mass shootings. But when we look at automobile accidents, in the United States, according to the Department of Transportation, there are 268.8 million cars in the United States, and every year there are over 5 million accidents, meaning that over 2% of vehicles are used in accidents. So why are we talking about regulating cars? It's a much bigger percentage that kills more people. The reason we're not talking about regulating cars is because the car is not what kills the person. It's the person behind the wheel. And it's the exact same thing when we look at gun violence. We need to look first to treat mental illness and make sure that people have the availability to get the help that they need in these situations instead of turning towards violence. The same way we would deal with someone who was drunk or high while they were driving and caused an accident. We would send them to a rehab facility and we would get them their treatment. So what we need is the ability to identify these problems before that person can become a violent shooter, and so that way we can prevent it. We should treat guns the same way we treat cars. Don't regulate the gun, help the person. Thank you.
Tyler, I will now entertain a speak from the opposition not to exceed 7 minutes.
Before I get started, I also want to thank everyone for being out here tonight. I know this is a really important topic and everyone has a lot of thoughts and feelings about it. So I'm glad that we get to be here and have this very educational discussion. So with that, I'm going to get started. So what we have to look at here today is basically the idea of what deaths and what injuries and harms are caused by guns. Now, my opponent in his last speech did bring up the fact that guns and gun-related violence were only used in a very, very minuscule amount of, or mass shootings were only a very, very minuscule amount of what guns were used for. Yes, my partners brought that up earlier. We talked about the fact that mass shootings only make up 1.2% of gun deaths. So what about the other 99%? We see that 62% of gun deaths are suicide. And we are in no way saying that, that guns are the only reason or the only way people are able to commit suicide. And my opponents bring up this idea that what people need is help and mental health resources in order to get better and to not contemplate suicide anymore. And I agree, we do need that because our mental health system in America is unbelievably broken. But at the point in time where I'm suicidal today, and I can go out and buy a gun tomorrow and end it, I don't have the time to go out and access the resources that would help me and help me get better. That's why we see here that the 62% of gun deaths that are suicides, we can get rid of that. The #1 preferred method of suicide for males in the United States is a gun. And there's reason for that because of how easily accessible it is. And that's something that we can eliminate. We also see this idea that my partners brought up, is this waiting period, because what this allows people to do, not just people who have suicidal ideations, but also people who consider going out and hurting others. It gives them time to calm down, to come to their senses, to think more rationally about things, and in a lot of instances to access the help that they need. What we also see here is that on violence as a whole, something my partner brought up in her first speech, and I really want to reiterate here, is that background checks have stopped 3 million gun sales. That's 3 million unique instances where a gun was kept out of the hands of someone who would misuse and abuse it. And we don't know how many lives were saved because of those background checks. We see with these statistics, and we see with all the past precedent, that these regulations do work, and they do result in a safer United States and a safer America. My opponent gets up in the speech that he just gave, and he uses this analogy of regulating guns and gun deaths and car and automobile accidents and deaths. And I have a few responses to this if we're going to go along with this. It's the idea, he said that with car accidents, we don't blame the vehicle, we blame the person driving, because it's just a tool. It can be used for good or bad. A gun only has one purpose. A gun wasn't made with the intention of getting someone from point A to point B and furthering people's ability to connect with each other. A gun was made for the purpose of killing whatever was on the other end of it. And what we see is that even with this, we do regulate cars. We have licenses for people who can drive, so we make sure people who can't drive are at the most risk of hurting and killing others, but they're not out on the road and we're not putting everyone at risk. We regulate the type of cars and the type of vehicles that are on roads to make sure everyone is safe. We see here that if we're going to have such harsh regulations on cars and background checks for drivers and licenses for drivers, why don't we do something for a gun? A tool that's only purpose is to hurt others. So with that, I'd just like to reiterate a few points here. What we're looking at today, this House believes that gun regulations will lead to a safer United States. So what is a safer United States? A safer United States is one in which a person who is suicidal today cannot go out tomorrow and buy the weapon that will kill them. So that way they have the time to get better and to access the resources that they need. A safer United States is not one in which a child can curiously play with the weapon that their parent keeps in the home. It's one in which it is mandated that that weapon is locked up and kept out of reach, thereby saving that child's life and saving a lot of families a lot of heartache. What we see here is that also my teammate, in her first speech, she brought up the fact that the regulations presented today have massive bipartisan support. 83% of gun owners, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, everybody, support background checks. 86% support waiting periods. And in a time where Pew Research says that we are more politically divided than we have ever been since the Civil War, we see that we can have both sides come together and support these regulations and these ideas because we see that they work.
And we see that they go through with what they're trying to do. And ultimately, we see that this House does believe in gun regulations will lead to a safer United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. I will now entertain a speech from the opposition. I would exceed 7 minutes.
Okay. So I would just like to thank everyone for coming out today and engaging in this great debate. Thank you to our opposition, MTSU, for creating a great clash, and thank you for joining our side. Thank you to my opponent, or my counterpart from Belmont, for joining us, and then thank you to the Women's League for allowing this platform for us to debate. And I'm going to go straight into it because we have a lot to talk about. So basically today, the balance between public risk and individual right and privilege came into focus today. So as the third speaker, I will add on to the points to strengthen our case. So our opposition just came up and talked about how we don't regulate cars. Well, what we do is we regulate the emissions in these cars. Tanks are legal in the United States. Thus, are we actually regulating cars if tanks are legal? Also, going to that, she also mentioned that the purpose of a gun is to kill. The purpose of a gun is for self-defense. According to a research done by Yale University, what they did was they took convicts and they asked the convicts, and 64% of those convicts said that they did not convict a crime if they knew that that person was armed. 64%. Thus, a gun is used to protect you, for self-defense. And then going into our 3 major points. So our first one is going to be mental health. So guns are not the most common method by which people attempt suicide. According to the Harvard Public Health magazine, drug overdose is the main method for suicide attempts. More gun control is unnecessary because relatively few people are killed by guns. According to the CDC leading cause of death reports, between 1999 and 2013, Americans were 21.5 times more likely to die of heart disease, 18.7 times more likely to die of malignant tumors, 2.4 times more likely to die of diabetes. Firearms were the 12th leading cause of death for all deaths between 1999 and 2013, responsible for 1.3% of deaths in the United States. And basically the major problem with firearms homicide is just deeply exaggerated. And gun controls and lower gun ownership rates do not prevent suicides. In Lithuania, one of the world's lowest gun ownership rates, they have the highest suicide rates in the world. Japan has a low gun ownership rate at 0.6 guns per 100 people and a high suicide rate of 18.41 suicides per 100,000 people. South Korea has a low gun ownership rate at 1 guns per 100 people, but they have the highest rate of suicide in Asia. And by contrast, the United States has the 26th highest suicide rate. And the highest gun ownership rate, and according to that just doesn't correlate. And then going to the mass shooting connected to mental health. 1 in 5 United States citizens have contemplated suicide. 1 in 5. We cannot sit here and deny mental health. What we're attacking here right now is the tools that are being used, but we're not actually talking about the root of the problem, and that is going to be mental health. So gun restriction laws focusing on people with mental health perpetrate the myth that mental health illness leads to violence, as well as the misperception that gun violence and mental health illnesses are strongly related. Stigma represents a major barrier to access and treatment of mental health, which in return increases the public health burden. We know this for a fact. We know that mental health is a large issue in the United States, and we know that nothing's being done to fix that. Thus, we cannot blame the gun epidemic for this. And then going into number 3, gun ownership. Gun control laws do not deter crime. Gun control laws do not deter crimes. Gun ownerships deter crimes. A November 26, 2013 study found that between 1980 and 2009, assault weapons bans did not significantly affect murder rates at the state level, and state restrictions on carrying concealed weapons had higher gun-related murders. While gun ownership doubled in the 20th century, the murder rate decreased. States with the largest increases in gun ownership also has the largest drop in violent crimes. The effect on shall issue concealed gun laws on these crimes, where two or more people were killed, has been dramatic. When states passed these laws, the number of multiple victim shootings declined by 84%. Deaths from these shootings plummeted on average by 90% and injuries by 82%. Survey found that 57% of people believe that owning a gun protects them from being victimized. Again, what my opposition said about guns being used to kill, that's not it. Guns are used as a self-defense mechanism. And then going again, onto that point, gun control laws infringe upon the right to self-defense and deny people a sense of safety. So if we impose these gun control rights, we're denying the people the right to self-defense. We're denying them the sense of safety and security that we're promised. According to again, another statistic, guns are used for self-defense 2.5 million times a year. The police cannot protect everyone. We know that for a fact. Stricter gun laws would make it more difficult for people to protect their homes and families. A professor at George Mason University of Law stated, "The right to self-defense and to the means of defending oneself is a basic natural right that grows out of the right to life." And many gun control laws interfere with the ability of law-abiding citizens to defend themselves against violent criminals. And then our fourth major point is America's foundation. The Second Amendment of the United States Constitution protects individual gun ownership. And in a 2008 Supreme Court case, the judges stated that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia and to use that arm for traditionally lawful purposes such as self-defense within the home. Again, self-defense is a major reason for gun ownership in the United States. And the founders understood that the right to own and bear laws is as fundamental and as essential to the maintaining liberty as are the rights of free speech, free press, freedom of religion, and other protections against government encroachments on liberty delineated in the Bill of Rights. If we do not have these guns to protect us, because the government has drones, they have tanks, they have all these things. If we do not have these guns to protect ourselves, then we're denying ourselves this sense of security and peace. And again, just going over our major 3 points again. Number 3 is mental health. Suicide, majority of annual gun deaths are suicides. 1 in 5 United States citizens have thought about committing suicide. We cannot sit here and just address the tools that are related to this problem. We have to address the root of this issue. Number 2 is mass shootings. 1% of gun deaths come from a mass shooter with severe mental issues, and we cannot expect gun regulation to basically fix this. We can talk about here with the failure in the FBI and Nicholas Cruz's case and the Florida shooting case. Reported 32 times, he should have shown up on the background check, but he didn't. And the FBI failed to follow on reports of Nicholas Cruz. They fixed failures in intel agencies and background checks will be more effective. Basically, 32 times Nicholas Cruz came up, he should have shown up in the background check, but he didn't, and thus if we keep regulating, it's not going to happen. And then number 2 is the gun ownership. Ownership is not the problem. In 79% of gun crimes, the perpetrator was carrying a firearm owned by someone else. We see this in multiple cases. Usually they're stolen guns, or their guns taken, and with that I end my time, so thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to, again, I'm Kaylin Jeebert, one of the League of Women Voters board members, and we would like to thank the 2 teams, and we have Laura Daniel and Bonnie Black, who are our 2 co-presidents, and we have a commemorative plaque for each team. If you'd like to give those to the team, we'll appreciate that. Representing the team.
And coach.
And we really do appreciate it because this is getting close to finals time at MTSU. And for these students to take the time to prepare for tonight, we really do appreciate all their extra efforts and energy. I wanted to introduce to you Faye Johnson, who is a longtime League of Women Voter board member and a past state president and current board member, to talk a little bit more about the League and why we set these kinds of debates up and the kinds of discussion and on the role of consensus in the League.
Thank you, but I really have to tell you, you warm my heart. As an old school teacher, oh my gosh, are your coaches proud or are you proud? That's awesome. Listening to the debaters, and I think they were beautifully prepared, it reminds me of the similarity between the way League approaches issues, and we are an issues-oriented organization, not a partisan organization, and the way the students prepare is really extraordinary. Because I actually had to go back, and Kate shared with me this morning, I had to refresh the League's position on gun control. And the process that we use when we're looking at issues, first of all, we want folks to be informed, very, very informed. And when they're informed and put their opinions together, we want them to participate. And with issues like gun control, actually the League's position, like most positions that it develops, actually was put together in 1990 before guns really became a national discussion. We study issues that are important to communities, not necessarily because they are the topic of the day, but simply because they affect the quality of citizenship. And it was interesting when I went back and reviewed the history, but 1990s, pretty far back, but actually the League of Women Voters of the United States, I think I'll just get it out of the way. Can I just use my school teacher voice?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, that's so much better. When they put their position together in 1990 at a state convention, first of all, and then those state conventions were brought together at the national level, and there was what was put together, we call it concurrence, where all kinds of arguments were brought for, against, different aspects, really studying an issue for all sides, coming together with representation from basically every state in the union. And the leaguers debated and then came together for a concurrence, which means a consensus on an opinion. And then it becomes the opinion of the league. It doesn't mean it's there forever, because it is oftentimes revisited as new information arises, just like our debaters had all this wonderful research that they read and put together their story, in essence, to make their case. So our particular position on this issue was revisited in 1994 and again in 1998. But notice, we studied it before it was really a political issue. We revisited it twice, but we don't revisit it every time some piece comes along. We stay firm because we actually do think that if you do your homework from the get-go, that your position is pretty solid and you can stay with it through time. Now, it doesn't mean you don't tweak it, but you can stay with it. So I would encourage you to go on to the League of Women Voters of the U.S. website and read our position on gun control and our history relative to that particular issue. And I'm not going to share it with you tonight because it would be another 20 minutes here. We really do study our issues. But I would encourage you to do that. But like this issue, all other issues that we tackle, either nationally, we have a national league, we have a state league, and we have a local league. So each of those various levels will have positions, but generally, always, they're aligned with each other. Oftentimes we'll take up a local issue that perhaps the state issue has not, or the state league has not been involved with. Sometimes the state takes up an issue the U.S. has not been involved with. But in fact, if the U.S. has a position, and the state could have a position relative to that topic, and then we can have a position relative to the local league. Oftentimes, our position locally is what the national is, and we stick with that. We don't go further with that. But we would encourage you, good citizens really do get informed. So we encourage you to do your research, to put together the arguments that you feel comfortable with, but base them on fact, that you explore differences of opinion, because this is what we're about. They did it so eloquently tonight. I just am so proud of them, because they really got into the case, presenting idea, challenging idea. That's civil discourse. And the way we have more of that is for us to model that. When we give our opinions, we need to thoughtfully construct those opinions based upon looking at various viewpoints relative to that particular issue. So we're pleased that you came out tonight. We're really pleased that you got to hear such a fun debate, and we would encourage you to attend more of these, okay, and maybe encourage more of these kinds of forums, perhaps at the high school level, even at the middle school level, and actually I'm a real old school teacher, really early on. I encouraged it. The 1 year I taught 5th graders, we had a debate. And by golly, it was good. When it was good, it was very good. But I think that's the way that we model. We don't have to be uncivil. We can be civil and bring forth issues and offer solutions that work with some consensus and some, if you will, give and take. So I would encourage you to do that. And we would encourage you, hey, I'm a leader. I've been a leader for actually 48 years. Okay? I've maintained my membership for 48 years. I can't stand up here and say that I don't encourage you to explore issues with us, because I think not only will you find it informative, but I think you'll find it fun, because we're pretty, look at all the leaders in the room, stick your hands up. We're pretty put together folk, and you could spend some time with us and we would just treasure that beyond measure, okay? So, thank you so much.
Articulated both the sense of what we were trying to do here and also the wider sense, the role of the league and what we're doing. My only comment would be is, again, in trying to replicate this in our own families and our own discussions and one thing or another, be sure to listen. We get so much today that we want to say, oh, I'm going to argue this, I'm going to argue that, and I'm going to use this or whatever. But as the students have done here, kind of go back and forth and say, let's talk again about the role of mental illness. Let's talk again about the efficacy of background checks or whatever. And try to get your discussions on some factual kinds of issues. And then you can talk about what the effects are or one thing or another. But being able to listen to the other person, this is particularly important, I think, as Faye was saying, for children, for youngsters to learn to talk and to argue. And I'm not sure how much we're doing of that in elementary and secondary school, but you can tell they're getting it really good, where they're coming with fine backgrounds and educations to apply it to this debate role in college. So we hope that you will continue to support MTSU and Belmont debate, because it does give students a different way to argue about things. I'm going to turn it back to Meredith, who has a couple of announcements about some of the future activities of the League. And thank you again all for coming out.
Thanks again for supporting these students coming out to our event and indicating your interest in this issue through your presence. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate all the participants. That was, I'm pretty impressed and feel like quite the underachiever. Thinking back to my college days, so well done. The League of Women Voters encourages informed and active participation in government. Our membership is open to women and men of all ages. We can provide you with forms. I think we might have some here with us tonight. You can go online and join at lwvrutherford.org. Membership is $60 a year. Scholarships are also available for student and young adults under 30. So we encourage you to join us. We have a membership meeting coming up Tuesday, May 8th, where we're going to be talking about planning our events and forums for the upcoming year. So we have a lot of exciting things coming, especially with this year being an election year. May 8th at 6 p.m. at the Heritage Center, so we would love you to kind of contribute your ideas for programming events for the upcoming year. Be watching for our upcoming candidate forums this summer ahead of the August and November elections. And remember, we're now in early voting for the May 1 primaries for the Rutherford County general elections. And we just watch our website and our Facebook page. We'll also hopefully be doing a little bit more on social media, so you'll be seeing a little bit more of us in the upcoming months. But again, I just want to thank everybody for coming out. Thank you to Belmont and MTSU for participating, coaches, debaters. We really appreciate it, and we hope to see y'all again soon. Thanks so much.